I would like to introduce Dr. Matt Burgess. Dr. Burgess is an assistant professor in environmental studies with a courtesy appointment in economics. His research focuses on economic growth futures and their environmental impacts, natural resource management and conservation, mathematical modeling of human environmental systems, and political polarization of environmental issues. So he's going to be talking to us today about how environmental economics can help scientists make better computer models that can more accurately predict future environmental impacts, which can in turn help people make better and more informed decisions about environmental policies and actions that can be taken. Also, in a world full of very current challenging environmental, societal, and health problems, he also will be offering us a message of hope, encouragement, and resiliency of things you can do in your own lives to ensure that you are in a place where you can work with others to find common ground solutions to these problems. Okay, I will turn it over to you, Matt.
Thanks so much, Alicia, and thank you to all who are here. I can't see you, but it's great to be with you. So yeah, as Alicia said, I'm going to talk a little bit about where I came from, how did I get here, a little bit about what I do, and with some specific examples. And then at the end, she said I'm going to try to offer a message of hope and resiliency. And the motivation for that is that I think it's easy to see professionals get up here and talk about what we do in our work lives, but a lot of building success comes from attitudes and actions that you take in growing yourself as a person, which also of course relate to interpersonal relations and polarization, and mental health. Mental health is an issue that's really important to me. There are some trends among youth that I find concerning, and also I think sometimes some messages that are sent to youth that are not especially helpful. And so I want to tie that all together if I can. And the norm in economics is to interrupt the speaker throughout the presentation, and so feel free to follow that norm. Raise your hand or interrupt however the platform allows. So without further ado, thanks a lot. Okay, so how did I get here? I'm a Canadian. I grew up in this town over here called Brossard, which is a suburb of Montreal. Montreal's an island. I don't know how many of you knew that. And then I did my undergraduate at University of Toronto, and topically, in terms of discipline, subject matter, my career has kind of come full circle. So I started out as an economics and poli-sci double major, switched into ecology, ended up almost getting minors in econ and math, and then I knew for my PhD I wanted to do a mix of ecology and economics, so I actually did it in ecology, but it was co-advised by an economist and did coursework for both degrees. And then I did a postdoctoral position at UC Santa Barbara before coming to CU Boulder in 2018. What are my research interests? I would say it's mainly these days these three things. So mathematical modeling of human environment systems. That just basically means using math or computers or both to try to come up with some kind of conceptual understanding of how some system works. And I'll give an example of this, what I mean by this in a second. The second one is thinking about what is the future of economic growth going to look like in the 21st century, and what does that mean for the climate and society? There's I think a decent amount of evidence to suggest that growth is going to look very different in the 21st century than it did in the 20th century, and that's going to mean that other aspects of society might look different. Some in ways that are more challenging, and some in ways that are maybe less challenging. And then lastly, reducing polarization in environmental issues. This is something that I got interested in very recently. Honestly, not so much motivated by my academic background, but motivated by what I saw as a need, which I'll explain later. But basically, I just don't see how we can solve problems like climate change in democracies without bipartisan cooperation, as hard as that may be. And so this is something I've become recently focused on. And our lab is pretty broad, and we have an unofficial motto, which is that we're interested in anything that's interesting. Okay, so I'm going to give a couple of examples of my research projects. The genesis of it, or maybe the motivation of it was I published this paper a couple of years ago in the journal Science, which is one of the big high-profile, high-impact scientific journals. And our paper, we used a pretty simple mathematical model that we kind of tuned using data and used that model to predict that it should be possible, if just by ending overfishing in a way that's focused on fishing profits, to collaterally or accidentally save about half of the most endangered sea turtles, marine mammals, and seabirds that are threatened by fisheries. And so this was a big, what you might call a big win-win story. We're saying, hey, we can get more profits and better conservation outcomes for things like sea turtles, if we manage fisheries better. And one of the things, and there's lots of other papers in environmental science like this that say there's, if you look at, we can feed the world and save the planet, right? There these papers that have these, that use usually fairly simple models and come up with these big, exciting win-win stories. And one thing that I've noticed, having written a couple of these myself, including this one, is that when you talk to people who do science or do management in specific systems on the ground, they're always a little bit skeptical about these, we can have our cake and eat it too, win-win kind of narratives. And the reason that they are varied from system to system, but they basically boil down to the idea that the world is more complicated than simple models. Okay, fine. So you can increase profits and reduce conservation, but what are the impacts of consolidating the industry on equity or something, right? Might be an example. Or sure, you could do that in theory, but the manager's never going to go for it. And so there's always these reasons that are basically related to the world being more complicated, either because there's more objectives in management than the 2 or 3 that we're modeling, or there's some kind of constraint, or there's different groups of people who have different interests that are involved that are not captured in these simple models. And so this motivated me and two of the folks that I work with. So Margaret Hegwood, who's a PhD student in my lab, and Ryan Langendorf, who's a postdoc, to think about, can we mathematically explain why managers are skeptical of these win-win studies? And it turns out you can. You can prove with a pen and paper, the kind of math you can solve by hand, that the ease with which you can find a win-win solution necessarily decreases, it gets harder as the number of objectives increases, or the number of groups with vested interests increases, or the number of constraints imposed by management increases. And also the severity of trade-offs necessarily increases as these measures of complexity of the system increase. And so basically we were able to prove in a really succinct way that that the managers we talked to about these simple modeling studies are right, and why they're right, which is kind of exciting, and also I think illustrates how I think people often think that modeling has to be super complicated. You have to be doing something that's blowing up a computer and some huge server somewhere in Silicon Valley or the middle of campus. And sometimes no. Sometimes you can come up with powerful insights just with a pen and paper. So that's an example of a modeling project. Here is a graph that illustrates a lot of what got me interested in this growth question. So the black line here is per capita GDP. Basically, you think of it as something like income per person at the level of the world, and these are long run average growth rates. So 1 would be that it's increasing by 1% every year. We're getting roughly 1% richer every year. And the thing that's interesting is we have the last 100 years have had quite a lot of economic growth, and the modern economics profession has been developed under that scenario, and so we kind of take it for granted. But it's actually a historically unusual thing. So there was very little economic growth at the global scale before in per capita GDP before the Industrial Revolution, that's what this black line shows. And then it came up, it dips here with the world wars, and then it comes back up. It dips again. Basically, the United States' growth peaks in the around 1960, 1970, and then China's peaks later, and that's why you have this valley here. Basically, it's the time in between the U.S. peak and the rise of China. But what's interesting is different models that economists have made pretty universally agree that growth is going to slow down throughout the 21st century. These are three scenarios that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change uses to forecast growth in CO2 emissions. And so this is, you think of this as the high growth scenario, the medium growth scenario, and the low growth scenario. And then this red line is basically the average trend in the recent data, kind of after the end of this black line. And the thing you can see is, first of all, everybody basically agrees that growth is going to slow down, but we don't know how much. But the data are lower. Growth has historically been slower than even the slowest of these scenarios. I don't have time to get into it in too much detail right now, but my colleagues and I have argued in a couple of recent papers that there's good reasons to think that this is not a fluke, that even before COVID-19, we were likely to be tracking along this low, closer to this low scenario. And in fact, COVID-19 makes that even more likely, because it turns out the defining feature of this low scenario that makes it so low is it assumes there's a retreat from globalization, which is not hard to imagine in a post-pandemic world where people are, countries are thinking, maybe it's not such a good idea to have our, essential metals and other kinds of supply chains dependent on other countries. And so that might reduce trade. Okay, so that has several implications. One is, if the economic growth is going to be maybe near the slowest of the scenarios, then emissions might be lower than the higher emission scenarios that you see a lot of apocalyptic headlines about too. And it turns out that is probably true. The other thing, which this paper that we're working on now looks at, is democracy didn't exist at a very big scale before the Industrial Revolution either. And I don't think a lot of people know that, right? Because there's these examples. Oh yeah, there was Rome and there was Greece. So it's not that democracy didn't exist at all, but if you plot the fraction of the world's population that lives in a democracy over time, it's almost zero before the Industrial Revolution and tracks growth very closely. And there's reasons to think that there's fiscal or public budget related challenges and also social cohesion related challenges for democracies in a world that's going to slow in growth. And so we've been thinking about how do we meet those challenges. And I guess to tease the answers we have so far is we need to raise taxes and we need more social solidarity, especially in countries that are diverse like ours. We can't be balkanizing ourselves into these, where everybody identifies with their subgroup more than we need to have some kind of a more united American identity. Okay, that's a nice segue into the political polarization stuff. So again, as I said, this is not something that I was really trained in. I'm not a political scientist, before coming here, but I've just become really concerned about it, and so I've done a lot of reading and self-teaching in this area, which actually is a metaphor for the importance of lifelong learning. That you're a lot of students, certainly when I was in high school, I thought this, that you're going to pick a major at the end of your senior year, and that's going to be prescribed the rest of your life. That's not how it works. Careers can definitely meander around as you learn new things. So I'm working with a really smart undergraduate student actually named Renee Marshall, who is cataloging and analyzing every bipartisan climate bill at the state level that's passed or failed since 2015 to look for patterns in what makes bipartisanship on climate change work, so that we can hopefully come with recommendations that will help us, maybe do something at the national level. We've also been, this isn't research, but maybe more in the category of service. We've been running a Reducing Polarization dialogue series at CU Boulder, where we have groups of students, staff, faculty, and politicians who come from all different ages, political backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, different gender backgrounds, sexual orientation, and basically just talk about, what they're thinking and feeling about current events to try to build empathy and understanding across differences. Okay, why am I really interested in polarization? I think this slide sums it up. I don't see a way around the fact that we basically have three options. We can get it done with bipartisanship. If you're talking about a big society level transformation, I don't see that happening, if it's being pushed by only one party, especially if it's being pushed by one party in a way that, for whatever reason, whoever you want to blame for it is divisive, because as soon as unless that party, stays in the White House forever, which is very unlikely, it's likely to be, anything that happens is likely to be later rolled back. So option one is, get it done with bipartisanship. Option two seems like we don't get it done. And then option three is we wreck democracy, to ensure that the person we like is in power. And we hope that that dictator is a climate hawk. And of course, the history of that is not great. So I don't like options 2 and 3. I think they're very bad. I think that people need to be more worried about these than we are, especially the more seriously we take climate change, which we should. And so that's why I'm really interested in building bipartisanship on that issue. Okay, so how do scientists influence policy? Basically three ways that I can think of. So one is you do, really splashy work that gets a lot of press attention on some policy relevant question, and then policymakers come to you and ask you for your feedback on it, right? So for example, our paper on economic growth and climate change was covered in the Wall Street Journal. Wouldn't be that hard to imagine, policymakers, coming to us to ask us about, what the implications are. Though I have to admit it hasn't happened yet. The second model is you work directly with decision makers from the get-go of your research to co-produce usable knowledge. So basically, you have a stakeholder. Stakeholder is just an academic buzzword for a government official or some interest group, and they have some NGO, and they have some problem they want to solve that relates to your expertise, and you go to them from the beginning and involve them in the design of the project that's going to help you figure out how to solve their problem, and then there's a natural pipeline for your solution into whatever their practice or advocacy is. That's the second. That's this first one is what I might think of as the most passive approach. The second one's the most active approach, and then the middle ground approach is is kind of in between. So you do some research that you think somebody would be interested in, and you reach out to them and say, hey, I've done this research. Are you interested in it? So an example of that might be I worked with a graduate student recently on a paper where we looked at what might be the effects of using satellite taxes to solve the problem of too much space junk. And he's done some outreach to different space agencies to see if they're interested in his idea. And question so far?
Yes, yeah. Matt. So in considering all these stakeholders, we have a question about some very key stakeholders in all of this. Isn't a huge problem with science-informed climate policy that most members of Congress and the Senate are lawyers with no background in science, who in fact use the skills of rhetoric to question and attack science when it shows facts that threaten their goals?
I actually think that's not the first order problem. Because what's really interesting, so there's a really interesting book that came out recently by Leah Stokes called Short Circuiting Policy. She's a political scientist at Santa Barbara. And one of the things that she's looked at this, and one of the things that she's found, which certainly tracks my intuitive understanding and my reading of data and studies on polling, is that the most voters in the Republican Party and even elected officials in the Republican Party don't genuinely disbelieve in climate change. But there are these lobby interests that prevent them from speaking their mind, basically, and sometimes encourage them to take these what you might call rhetorically stretched arguments. And it's not necessarily always true. I mean, there are a few who genuinely don't believe in climate change, but without naming names, I have heard from, for example, people who do advocacy for, there's a couple of groups that I know of that do advocacy. It's like young Republicans are very concerned about climate change. And so there's some groups of young Republicans that lobby politicians from their own party to do more about climate change. And you hear sometimes stories about kind of the, what I can say behind closed doors and in public isn't quite the same thing. There are other kinds of issues like guns is another issue that's a little bit like that. So I don't know. I think it may be true that there are some politicians that don't know enough science, but I think that's not the most important. That's not the biggest reason why the politicians are behaving in the way that they are. In some cases, I think it's that there are these political pressures that are stopping them from taking a different position that they either explicitly or at some level know is true. Good question. And of course, other people may disagree with me. Okay, so yeah, so the last thing, I've given different versions of this in audiences of undergrads, for example. I call it advice everyone should get, but few will give you, and it's framed around things that I think are helpful to know and to think about in terms of attitudes that will help you succeed and be happier and have better relationships and also better mental health. And maybe contribute less to the problems that we have in terms of societal divisions. So the first one is prioritize your happiness, and obviously when I say happiness, I don't mean that instant gratification. I don't mean kind of do what you want to do that feels good, immediately always. But I think that it is true that you meet a lot of people who are prioritizing something that's not their happiness, right? So maybe they want to work in a specific industry, or their parents or their spouse really want them to do a specific type of thing, or live in a specific place, and then zillion other things, right? And the basic point I want to make is, if you prioritize something that's not happiness over your happiness, don't be surprised if you're better at that something than you are at being happy. That's trite, but it's true. And relatedly, pay attention to what makes you fulfilled, which again is not the same as instant gratification. So what makes you proud of who you are and what you're doing? Who are the people that make you feel good about who you are, that you can hang around, etc. Something related to this is and honestly related to all these things is social media is not real life. And is often opposite of has the opposite tendencies to everything I'm saying. So the social media is not all bad, but in moderation is a good advice. Build and embrace agency. So there's a lot of messages I think that young people get these days that are the effect of that focus on every aspect of life that you can't control, and sort of to dwell on it and to feel victimized by it. And the evidence in positive psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy is overwhelming that the way to feel happy is to build, and also to be successful, is to build and embrace agency. So to focus on what you can control, which is often more than you think, and to focus on building that in a direction that's you find constructive. Somewhat relatedly, there's young people are really inspiring these days, in that it seems like you all really want to make the world a better place, and that's great. My one piece of advice would be, if you want to make the world a better place, look outward. Look what are the needs of the world. I think there's a trap that's easy to fall into, as if I push and advocate for my own interests and the interests of people who are like me, that's good for the world. And again, history doesn't really support that. The somewhat related to the agency thing, there's a lot of evidence that emerging, and particularly recently, that people are anti-fragile in a lot of different ways. So, for example, there are studies that have found that if you grow up with a dishwasher, you're more likely to have allergies, because having some germs in your house boosts your immune system in a way that makes it less likely to randomly attack itself, which is basically what an allergy is. Same thing when you go, if you go to work out at the gym, what you're literally doing is you're making little tears in your muscles when you're lifting weights, and then those tears fill in and make your muscles bigger. And so you're literally making your muscles bigger by stressing them. Bones are the same thing. You build bone density by walking, and astronauts who are in space for a long time lose bone density. There's increasingly evidence that this also applies to emotional and intellectual strength. So if you go through life avoiding challenging situations, ideas that you don't like, people that you find challenging, you're going to have a lot harder time handling them when they inevitably find you. I wish I could say you will never encounter, ideas, people, or situations you don't like in life, but I guarantee that's not true. You certainly will. And so I encourage you all to surround yourself. Instead of trying to surround yourself with people who think exactly like you, try to surround yourself with mentors, friends, etc., who challenge your ideas and beliefs, because that's going to make you intellectually stronger and emotionally stronger. Somewhat relatedly, times of polarization and fear are times when it's easy for simplistic ideologies that present tribal solutions to hard problems. So if we just demonize and ostracize this group of people, we can solve this problem. Throughout history, those kinds of things become more widespread in tumultuous times like this. And again, there's the history of them actually solving the problems is non-existent. And so beware of those simplistic messages. And then lastly, related to climate change, the world is not going to end in 12 years. We do have a big challenge ahead. Climate change is real. It's a big problem. We need to do something. We need to make big steps as a society to solve it. But it's also true, and we shouldn't take for granted, that if you look at the past 100 years, almost every measure of human well-being in almost every world region has improved dramatically. And this is probably going to continue in the coming decades. It's not to say that we don't have big problems and we shouldn't get to work solving them, but I don't think it's helpful for young people's mental health to think that things like the world's going to end in 12 years. And of course, this statement, there's literally no scientific basis to this statement. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to stick around for a little bit and take questions or comments. And thanks again for having me.
Okay, thank you so much, Matt. Those were some really, I think, great suggestions and things that I think a lot of times when we talk about actions, personal actions that students can take, oftentimes we hear about the simple ones: turn off lights, don't drive, or encourage your parents to not drive you everywhere, and things like that. But I feel like Matt has given us some things to think about today, I think, that are even more personal than that. I think that really can help us as people better be able to handle environmental challenges and better understand how to work with others to build common ground solutions on things. So I appreciate that advice that you shared with us. We had kind of a follow-up question / comment when you had answered the question about the lawyers, and she had said that a corollary to this is that many scientists who report science are sued at times by said lawyers, so much so that there is now a special legal defense fund for the scientists. What about a fourth branch of government that is the branch of science-informed policy that needs to be like a Supreme Court of top scientists elected by Nobel laureates?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. There is, first I'll say that, while I'm sure that there are examples of litigation against climate scientists. I can say with a decent amount of confidence that it is not a high-level concern, at least in any of the climate scientists that I've met. So I don't think it's true. I think that, or maybe to qualify that a little bit, I think the much bigger area where scientists are concerned about censorship is when they work directly for the government, right? So there was a example that I personally found quite unsettling of the science. I think he was the top scientist at NOAA being replaced, basically overnight because he had some, I thought, fairly uncontroversial statement about the importance of science being primary in in NOAA policy. So I would say that is, and you see that kind of thing in other countries too. So that used to be a big concern among climate scientists in Canada under our previous government. But yeah, there's not like lawyers suing scientists in a way that materially affects their careers is just not something that you hear about often enough that anybody I know is that concerned about it. Now, that said, your recommendation I actually think is an interesting recommendation regardless. And certainly I think there are some people who are pushing for a more robust science policy apparatus in the government. I don't necessarily know if it would, if you'd want to look like a Supreme Court or something, more arm's length, kind of like a congressional budget office, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of honestly a little bit beyond my expertise, but I think that the idea that we would want science to have a prominent role in policy is a good one. I also think that with that power comes some responsibility that scientists are not always good at taking, which is we need to be honest about when we're wearing our science hat and when we're wearing our citizen hat, and when we're wearing our expertise hat and when we're wearing our non-expertise hat. So for example, I'm an economist. If I say that I don't know, clouds are not going to affect the climate as much as the climate scientists say or something, I have no leg to stand. I don't have any expertise that's relevant to that, right? I can say that if I want, but I'm saying that effectively as a citizen, not as a scientist. Now that example may seem strange. You don't see that example very often, but an example you do see sometimes is physical climate scientists saying, I have the proof in my climate model that we need to abandon capitalism. And it's like, well, actually, that isn't your expertise, right? So it would, and again, it's fine for people to have those opinions, but you have to be honest about when is your opinion coming from directly from your scientific training and when it's not. And relatedly, that for policy recommendations, right? So so as a scientist, you're right to be wearing your scientist hat and saying, we know that the planet is warming and it is likely to have this impact and this impact and this impact if we don't stop it. That's not the same thing as saying, and I know the solution is a carbon tax or the Green New Deal or whatever else you might advocate for. And again, it's fine to advocate for what you think is the right policy, but it's important to be clear about when you're speaking directly from your data and directly from your expertise, and when you're speaking from your own normative opinions as a citizen. And I think that one of the reasons why scientists sometimes are too cavalier about that is that I think they get the direction of causality in terms of the trusted position of science backwards. So I think that the mindset sometimes is scientists are this trusted position in society. We got to use that to advocate for making the world a better place in the ways that we know and think are important. And that assumes that the trust is this constant thing that isn't dependent on what we do with it, right? When in reality, we have that trust as experts only insofar as we're honest and communicate with integrity about what our expertise is and what our expertise isn't. And I think I think we could all be better at striking that balance. I think there's some scientists who kind of go too far into muddying the waters of kind of what's expertise and what's advocacy, and then there's some scientists who are too afraid of doing that, and so never don't do enough communication and don't do enough advocacy because they're afraid of of losing their scientist hat. And I think you can have it both ways as long as you're just very clear and very honest about here's what I think as a citizen and here's what I think I know as a scientist.
Thank you for that insight. That's really interesting. So we just have time. Just want to ask you one other question. What would you recommend for students that are interested in this field of work? Like, what are things that they should study in school? What are experiences that they should try to gain?
Yeah, take as much math and as much coding as you can is the main I can give. It's those math and coding I think are harder to learn not impossible, but they're harder to catch up on, right? So it's especially when you're talking about an issue like climate change, it's always in the news. There's going to be a lot of news coverage of different perspectives and different socio-political issues, and obviously there's also a lot of deep expertise in social and political sciences, that on that goes way beyond current events. But you will never open up the New York Times and read an article about how to solve a differential equation, right? And so there's a bit of an asymmetry there in that you have to be a little bit more deliberate early, I think, about getting those math and computer skills and statistical skills, as much as you can. That'd be my advice.
Okay, great. So see, who knew that math could basically solve all of the world's problems?
I didn't say that. I don't think it can, but it can provide helpful insight. I mean, basically, math is formalized logic, and logic applies to everything.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate the time that you took today to speak with the students and teachers that were, and anyone else that was attending today. This webinar will be recorded and available on our website, so you can refer to it later. Also on our website, you can find some more resources related to Dr. Burgess's talk. And you can find some news articles related to his research, and also videos and a game that can further help you to understand how computer models work and how they can be used to help us make informed decisions about environmental actions that can be taken. And then finally, if you would like to join us again next week at this time, we will have another scientist speaking at 1 p.m. Videographer on Ice by Leanna Nixon, and she'll be talking about her experiences on the Mosaic expedition in filming a planetarian show in the Arctic Circle. Thank you very much, and hope you all have an enjoyable and great rest of your week.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Matt.